This is Morgan Creasel, contributing reporter for News Junkie. Today I'm here with Jill. How are you doing today, Jill?
Doing great, thanks.
Jill is a Pulitzer Prize winning data reporter with the Marshall Project, where she investigates issues in the criminal justice system and creates data visualizers and writes methodologies for other journalists to replicate her work. I believe your most recent one was investigating hospital drug testing at childbirth. Can you take us through that project, how it came about first, and then how you gathered your data sources and all of that?
I was brought in to help a very robust area of reporting that my colleague Shoshana Walter had been doing for years and done some groundbreaking work exposing that this problem existed, which is the problem of very faulty drug testing at childbirth. Women go into the hospital to give birth, and either it's mandatory drug testing of the baby or the mom, or in some cases it's discretionary, but you may be drug tested at childbirth. And those drug tests cast a really wide net. So that means a lot of people get swept up into these tests that come back with false positives. You get situations where people have taken totally legal substances that flag as illegal substances, like poppy seed bagels flagging as opiates, and even baby wash products flagging as THC, all sorts of scenarios. Or drugs that women are prescribed or given during pregnancy or during childbirth, fentanyl in their epidurals, and then testing positive for fentanyl, but that test being misinterpreted as an illegal consumption of a controlled substance. Shoshana had been doing incredible reporting for a long time on this issue. I was brought in to help offer some data to contextualize the scope of this problem, because what was happening after these drug tests that she was able to see was that there were situations where women were being arrested, women had their babies taken away from them, sent to child welfare, interrogated, and that this was very bad for the babies and the moms. So our question was, how often is this scenario really happening? And we were able to get data from the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect, which is a warehouse that stores data for the Federal Children's Bureau. And child welfare agencies submit data to the Federal Children's Bureau voluntarily. And a lot of times that data is wrong, which is what we learned, which was a big part of this process, was going back to the child welfare agencies that submitted this data. There were about 20 of these states that submitted it, and about half of them said the data was wrong and that we needed to not include the data or update our numbers or request new information. This
Their
whole
own data
process.
that they submitted was wrong?
Yeah, I think it's a really good reminder that like you have to triple check everything. Just because it's in an official source doesn't mean that it's right. We're getting the data in a circuitous way rather than going to child welfare directly. It was information they had submitted and we got elsewhere. So it was a good reminder. You have to go back to the original source and make sure they know what they've submitted and that you're interpreting it. Yeah, so we went through this whole big process to get data from states all over the country as much as we could. And we found that there were 70,000 cases where women were accused of using drugs during pregnancy and then referred to law enforcement, either police or prosecutors. And that data covered 21 states and a 6-year period.
Wow. Okay. Did the states give you a reason why their data that they've submitted might be wrong or where those mistakes came from?
There was one state, they said they had accidentally submitted data every time a form had been filled out, suggesting that they may notify law enforcement, but not the actual notifications themselves. And the filling out of the form was mandatory, but the actual notifications to law enforcement were rare. So that was an error on their part. There were other states where, in a state like Texas, at first it looked like their child welfare agency in Texas refers very few cases to law enforcement over alleged substance use during pregnancy. And then when we talked to them, they said, oh no, that's wrong. We refer every single case. It's mandatory under our state laws. We don't know why the data is so off, but it's probably just that we didn't do a very good job of collecting it. So you see that too. States where they're doing their best, but they don't have a mechanism to get information from maybe a county child welfare agency up to the state to then report it to the federal level. So there's just lots of missing information.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we've been seeing like a lot of staff cuts, budget cuts at federal kind of data collection agencies. Is that a similar problem with these state and county agencies where it's staff cuts, resources are so short that these mistakes are bound to happen?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Some places, some states, it seems like just never did a good job of collecting this information because it's not a priority. But we know that more staffing would certainly help and maybe rethinking the priority of what those staff members are doing. We talked to several child welfare agencies that told us we are totally swamped with these positive drug tests of pregnant people, and we're being told to prioritize these cases as potential high risk situations for the mother and baby. And yet, if we're doing that, we're actually deprioritizing other types of cases like accusations of violence in the home and criminal conduct. And so it's because they're getting mandates about what matters, and there's a really broad brush being cast here where every positive drug test goes to child welfare, and then child welfare is, oh my God, we're overwhelmed. What do we do with this? So there is, yeah, we definitely found that there was an issue of staff not having enough time with these cases and with these families and feeling like they couldn't do a good enough job.
I feel like there's been a lot of panic as I've been covering the way that the federal government is pulling away and defunding all the data infrastructure because you can have the information, but if you don't have all of these different stop points where it can be analyzed, where it can be put onto the next place correctly, the usefulness just falls to the side.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge issue. And a lot of people, whether that's advocates, attorneys, journalists, are thinking about that. And there's a great resource, the Data Rescue Project, that I follow, that's going through this effort to try to save some of these data sources so they don't disappear forever. But if the data is no longer being collected, then we miss the opportunity to use it. And it's not just data for data's sake, right? These are stories of real people or of funding and how our money is being spent or lives impacted by government policy. And so this is not, if it goes away, then we're missing a lot, and we're missing a lot of transparency about our government agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. As this kind of the federal infrastructure is crumbling under attack, I think the way that projects like the Marshall Project, like I've been talking to a lot of kind of prison advocacy organizations like the Prison Policy Initiative, and I just talked to somebody from Black and Pink last week. So these kind of independent analytic organizations coming in and being able to take the pressure off of the federal agencies, the state agencies is huge. But you're right, you have to have the data collection in order to have the independent sector be able to step in. Speaking of that, and you were talking about the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect and the Federal Children's Bureau. Have you seen any impacts on collection from those agencies?
I haven't heard anything that suggests that their data collection has stopped or changed. Perhaps I'm speculating, but just because it's voluntarily submitted data by the states and they don't do much to process it, vet it, they just hang on to it and then it can be requested mostly by researchers, but they gave us the opportunity to request and get the data as well. That data I haven't seen affected, but it's interesting because it wasn't very accessible. Before we got it, it was really made available to researchers. And so we went through a long negotiation process trying to explain why we think we should take a look at this data and the kinds of analysis we would want to run and why we think we can be responsible with this data. And we we spent a long time on this project, and I think we were very careful in any conclusions we were drawing from a data set that had a lot of missing information and a lot that we knew was underreported. What can you conclude from a data set that has so many missing values in it? Ultimately, we were happy with where we landed. We were in touch with the National Data Archive throughout the process, and we published the data. So if you go to the Marshall Project's website, there is data that you can download on these how often allegations of substance use during pregnancy result in referrals to law enforcement for the 21 states that we have data for. But we also have other data in there as well, pretty much anything we could get on this topic. And we spent a year going back and forth with child welfare agencies in every single state in the country to, in the instances where we could not get the data, at least know what their policies are. When does child welfare refer to law enforcement? Under what circumstances? So we really did everything we could to make the existing information that we could access better and make it available to the public.
I noticed that Marshall Project really has that kind of collaborative spirit where you are making the data public, you are writing these methodologies to help other journalists and researchers. Can you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind that and why you guys are willing to share your work in that sort of way?
Yeah, I think that we operate on transparency. That's how we get information. And so we're transparent in what we give back. There, we have a whole initiative called Investigate This, where we produce toolkits designed for other journalists that we have specific funding for, that we really care about is not only are we able to do a certain amount of reporting, but if we can help other journalists report on the same thing or report on it in a responsible or thoughtful way, that is furthering our mission to expose what's happening in the justice system. It's not like we as one institution can change everything in the way the justice system works or expose it all, but by building a network of journalists who are capable of doing good reporting in this space, I think it just makes everything stronger.
I feel like there was this feeling in journalism for a long time, the competition. We have to have the exclusive story. We're always at each other's throats. But there's this whole rise of nonprofit journalism lately as I think the old institutions are no longer as viable. We had this whole like you know how it is. But something positive that has come from journalism going through these hardships is the willingness to collaborate, seeing it as more of a public good than a product. I really admire you guys and the kind of like co-ownership of truth and information. Like we all deserve to have this knowledge about how the criminal justice system works because it's such a black box without this reporting. You were talking about the holes in the data and how tricky that is to be able to analyze it. What were the ways that you addressed the holes that you were able to work around the gaps and be able to analyze and to draw conclusions from imperfect data?
I feel like depends on how nerdy everybody wants me to go in answering this question because there's missing data on several levels. One thing is that any values below 10 were suppressed in the data that we got for that project to protect the confidentiality of individuals because these are children who may have been abused. Theoretically, that's why these cases get referred to law enforcement. And so we had some number of values that we were missing, and we didn't know whether that value was a 0 or a 1 or a 9, and how does that impact what we're trying to say. But more broadly, there were a lot of unknowns about how good is the data collection in Ohio versus Texas, and what might be missing from those numbers, and how do we think about that? And so we always try to be conservative in an analysis, draw the least extreme conclusions we can if we think we might be exposing a problem. Let's give this problem the benefit of the doubt if there are some unknowns, and let's see whether the problem is still there. So, like, we try to use the minimal estimates. If we wanted to, we could maybe try to come up with maximal estimates that there could be 100,000 plus referrals to law enforcement if you maybe try to come up with a way to estimate how much missing data there is. But that's not really useful to people. We want to say with confidence that we know at least 70,000 cases were referred, and we know that it's an undercount. We can't tell you how much it is, but we try to be definitive when we can rather than estimating and be conservative in order to provide people with useful information. I think the Marshall Project, like, we're okay with saying what we don't know. We don't want to exaggerate and we want to be transparent if there's information we don't have. So we published, along with that story, like a very long methodology that was detailed in all of the caveats with the data, things that were missing. So people know this is transparency. And it's also if somebody were to come to us and say, hey, did you think about this? Or if they have a concern that maybe we were misleading people, we'll say, no, look, everything's available. You can take a look at what we've got here and see for yourself how thoughtful we were in everything we did.
Okay, so the methodology besides like helping other reporters is also showing your work. Hey, that's a good I feel like there's a lot of worry these days too about kind of retribution. I don't know how well you can really protect yourself these days, but it's a good start.
It's a bit of a CYA, right? You're being very clear on what you did. And before publishing, I go back to whatever entity I got data from or I'm drawing conclusions about and share what we plan to publish. We don't believe in surprises and catching somebody off guard because they are represented in a certain light in a story. And that's really helpful. I think it allows for an ongoing dialogue. Everybody knows in advance, and it minimizes angry phone calls from people who are like, how could you do this? Like, that's not the business we're in.
I feel with data journalism, it's not a gotcha kind of situation. It's slower, it's working together with these agencies. Collaborative maintaining relationships part of it is something that really interests me in the project that I'm working on, especially as federal data becomes less reliable. I think it's up to the independent sector a little bit more to band together and to start analyzing more and helping each other fill in gaps that are missing.
Yeah, we do lots of partnership projects. We believe in them, and that's part of our model to get our reporting out to more people is co-reporting and co-publishing with other newsrooms. And like you said, I think it's at a time when newsrooms are strapped for resources. So you might as well work with other journalists across publications if it means that you can divide and conquer and maybe we can provide data skills and another newsroom can provide more on the ground reporting, or maybe there's another way to divide up the work that, plays to each newsroom's strengths and allows for more ambitious journalism.
Can you talk about any of those partnerships that you've worked on?
I've only been at the Marshall Project for a year, so I feel like a lot of them are still in progress or in the early stages. But there's been some great work across the newsroom that has involved partnerships. One thing that we did do last summer when immigration really became a big issue in the news every single day because of the immigration raids. Our newsroom was doing reporting in Florida. I was one of several reporters. We were speaking with somebody who had been incarcerated in Florida. He had gotten into a fender bender and was turned over, I believe, by a sheriff's department to ICE, and he had been deported. We were able to speak with him. One of our reporters spoke Spanish. We got him on the phone. This was a story we were going to be publishing in English on our site, The Marshall Project, which is not a place where probably people impacted or people who care about this issue are necessarily going to be.
Mm.
So we worked with Telemundo and they were able to get that out in Spanish to their audience. And that's what matters too, is like reaching the right people and trying to get your work out into new spaces where people aren't automatically coming to you.
When I was talking to Kenna Barnes at Black and Pink, we talked about that because Black and Pink is primarily an advocacy group that works with LGBTQ prisoners. And they do data analysis, but most of their data projects, they did surveys with prisoners, was collaborative with the Vera Institute and with the ACLU and things like that. But she was emphasizing it is really important for larger analytic research institutes to partner with these grassroots level organizations that are plugged into the communities that are either being studied or you're trying to outreach to. And I think that is really important to keep in mind, especially as the kind of top-down surveillance state level data is harder to come by. Do you have any recommendations for groups who are on the ground connected to immigrant communities, to detainees?
There's a group, forgive me if I'm getting the name wrong, but I think it was called the National Immigrant Coalition. Vera Institute of Justice does some good work with immigration data. And then a lot of this has been speaking with attorneys who represent immigrants in immigration court in places on the ground that you're reporting in. I was doing some reporting in Chicago about Operation Midway Blitz and what happened to people who were swept up in that operation and where did they end up. Partly because Illinois has a moratorium where they are not incarcerating people in immigration detention facilities there. And as a result, people get moved elsewhere. They get moved all over the country. So we were looking at that, and we knew that we needed to actually talk to affected families and speaking with advocates in communities that have detention centers and speaking with immigration attorneys allowed us to talk to the family members of people who were in these facilities or who had been in these facilities and could tell us what it was really like, what the conditions were, and how cold it was, or how there was an outbreak of an infection in one of the facilities, and so on. That is good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting.
Did being able to talk to the families illuminate differences between that experience and then what was being reported and the data?
It really supplements anything you can get from data. And this is my philosophy as a data journalist is like the data is just numbers and you have to find the stories of people who are impacted or it's not even worth it. It's very hard to get people to care about just some numbers on a page. Like we're not researchers, we're journalists, and it's important to explain to people like why this matters. What actually is this data showing? And so if we're talking about the hundreds or thousands of people swept up in an immigration raid, I very much believe that it's important to talk to impacted individuals. And that's hard work. And I think some journalists may stop at the point of talking to people in positions of authority because they're easier to access. But if you do really want to know what's going on, you're just going to get a richer story about people who've been there and can actually talk about it firsthand, rather than an official who might have an incentive to say things are working well or look a certain way. So it makes for way better reporting.
I think you can end up repeating the official line in that way and reinforcing.
I talk about this a lot because I do a lot of work thinking about crime statistics. And there's a lot of news all the time about crime is going up or crime is going down in this area or that area or that part of the country. And it is oftentimes repeating what you might see in a police report rather than digging in deeper. I think it's my personal mission to help improve crime reporting. I really care about that. And so I try to educate journalists on taking a closer look at the data to see whether the official narrative actually bears out. So, as one kind of example, crime is way down across the whole country, and it has been going down and down for the last couple of years. But if you were to zoom in on any particular police agency, you might hear them say, crime is going down because we got a bunch of new equipment or because we instituted a very new workforce or task force that helped tackle a certain kind of crime. Basically, police agencies very much like to talk about what they're doing well and how that's reducing crime. But if
Mhm.
you look at the data, it's not just happening in one location, right? This is a trend happening all over the US. So if you put your thinking cap on, you might be able to suss out that one thing that one police agency did or is trying to take credit for isn't the whole story here. But you got to be a little bit thoughtful about the data that you get and what it's showing and what it's not showing to be able to interpret that.
I feel like I hear all the time crime data is so hard. There's so many factors that kind of impact it. Just because crime is down right now, you can't say that one thing is causing it because it's so complicated. I imagine working with crime data all the time is maddening in that way.
It takes a lot of thought and consulting with experts who know way more than I do. I totally recognize that journalists are on deadline and they have to do things quickly sometimes. But even in small ways, I think there are things that we can do to improve how we report on this topic.
Can you take us through what are those small ways?
I am in the process of working on a toolkit for our Investigate This series at the Marshall Project that's going to really, in a lot of detail, talk about some of these things. But one example is, yeah, checking to see if the trend is happening. If you're seeing crime go up or down, is it going up and down in other places or just in the place that you are? And then also looking at several years of data is really helpful because crime is cyclical. And so you may look at murders if you're not very familiar with crime data and see that it went up from 10 murders in January to 20 murders in July. And I, as somebody with experience with crime data, would say that's not surprising at all. Crime murders go up in the summer. They just do. There's people are outside more. This is a known phenomenon. So in order to factor that in, just look at the last few years of data rather than just doing a year-to-date calculation. There's lots of little things that you can do and ask for the underlying crime data rather than just if the police say murders went down by this much, look at the underlying data and just do a quick check to see whether that's actually right. Think about whether you should be reporting percentages or raw numbers if you have very small values. If you're saying aggravated assaults went up from 2 to 4, yeah, that's a 100% increase and they doubled, but we're talking about really small values, right? So you want to be as fair as possible. And in that case, it might be better to say they went up from 2 to 4 rather than doubles because that of the impression it leaves people. I think this stuff, even though it might seem small, is really important because the public has this perception that crime is always going up. More than half of Americans think that crime is going up, even though we're seeing historic drops in crime. And journalism plays a real role in that. And that makes us feel unsafe in our own backyards when we think that we could be a victim of a crime at any time. I think it's very important to get this work right.
What are ways that journalists and data journalists can fight back against these narratives? This is something that I think about a lot is it's so hard to be heard over the noise and especially over a really compelling, tight, clean narrative of like the whole immigration thing. Immigrants are coming to steal your jobs, they're bringing crime. That's why we need this crazy deportation. What are the ways you guys have been thinking about to cut through the noise and how do you fight against a narrative that is so compelling, especially when people who are concerned with truth, you have to take your time, you have to show your work, you have to be nuanced and complicated, where the liars get to be clean and simple. Yeah.
Debunking is really hard and it takes a long time. And I don't know that we've figured out a solution that makes what we do as compelling and easily digestible as somebody who can point to a single egregious case and that sparks outrage. Sure, there are examples of immigrants who have committed violent crimes. But what we try to do is look at the big picture, look at the research, look at the data itself. Like you can look at the data that the government itself releases, that ICE publishes, and see that most of the people that are being swept up into the immigration raids now are people with no criminal records at all. You can try to use these things to help combat the official narratives. A couple of years ago, my colleague worked on a story about the myth of the criminal immigrant, is what it was called. And what I liked about that piece was that it was very graphic forward. So rather than it being a story with lots of writing that you had to digest, it was just like these three charts will tell you if you follow it, this is what the research actually shows. People come into the country and their rates of committing violence are actually lower or are actually neutral compared to the citizen in America. Sometimes I think being creative about the way we present information could help as well. I remember that piece did well and people still come back to it. It's still a resource. People look it up because it's in the news. People are asking, they're Googling and saying immigration and crime, and they don't know whether it's true or not. And so if it's not published and you haven't made that resource available, certainly people won't be able to find it.
Okay, you said it was your mission to improve crime reporting. Are there more points to your mission that we haven't discussed yet to improve crime reporting?
I think that one way is that you might hear this come up from time to time, this kind of metaphor of journalists don't report on the sharks that don't bite people. So when things go well, they don't really get as much attention. So, the stories out now, there certainly is reporting on crime going down, right? But it's not nearly as much reporting as on specific incidents of serious crime or the narratives of that police are saying about a crime going up. Not all of them, but some of them might still be making this claim. I think we can do a better job of looking at the whole picture of what we know about different crimes and potentially do a better job of reflecting that in our storytelling. And it's harder to write about crime going down and to talk to people about crime going down and feel like that's a compelling story. But it really can be. If you start to think outside of the box a little, you can talk to advocates, you can talk to people who are doing the really important work of violence interruption or volunteer work for people suffering from domestic violence or whatever it is. Like these are that's solutions-oriented journalism talking about not just a problem, but the fact that there are people dedicated to addressing those problems. I also think it's helpful to just be specific, and this would be for any topic, but it is true in crime reporting as well, is I try not to actually say crime is going up or crime is going down, despite me saying it a bunch of times here. But like when I write a story, I'm like, murders are down X% from this time to this time, offering a level of specificity. And if you're not talking about murders, what crime is it that you're talking about? What crime category are we talking about here? Are we talking about assaults? Are we talking about property crimes? Being specific, because when people hear crime, they have very different perceptions of what that actually means.
I was talking to from Black and Pink. She brought up this problem of digital mailing centers for prisons about how it's so much harder to get physical mail in now. And so they were doing a lot of their surveys through their physical newsletter. And I know you guys were doing surveys through your newsletters. So I was wondering if you had come up with, have you been digitizing? Are you guys like still getting into prisons with your newsletters?
I actually don't know the answer. We continue to circulate inside prisons, but I can't really speak to that specific issue and how that's affected our circulation. But I do know that's a phenomenon. I was helping a reporter do some data review for a story out of Ohio, and what was happening in the Ohio prisons is that people were no longer getting physical mail at all because there were concerns that any paper products that prisoners were getting were being dipped into synthetic drugs, illegal substances that people were consuming. They were digitizing the mail, and then people were able to view digital versions of the mail, but not be able to get physical copies. So I think, yeah, there's access is a huge problem in prisons and jails, and we totally get that. And that's one of the things I love about the Marshall Project is the very clear effort that we make to not report about a community, but also with and for a community. And that's why we have writers who are incarcerated, who we offer contributing stories to our website, and we continue to have a dialogue. And we don't just ask members of the public or sheriff's departments what July 4th means to them. We ask incarcerated people what it means. That's really important. Those voices are missing a lot.
I feel this cutting off incarcerated people from physical mail and kind of was talking me through how a lot of these mail processing centers are in different states from the prisoners, and you can't address the letters to the prisoners anymore. You have to find the mailing center in whatever state in order to get it to that prisoner back in your state. And it seems like a total attempt to just limit their access and limit the public's access to what happens to people who are incarcerated. I feel like is an overarching theme of this administration is cutting off public access, cutting off public knowledge. But have you seen that in your reporting and your work? Is it getting harder for you to have that access and to reach the sources that you were using before?
It is hard. When I literally my first week at the Marshall Project a year ago, almost exactly, I think it's a year Tuesday, I wrote a newsletter. We have a weekly newsletter called Closing Argument, which is a synthesis or analysis of a justice topic. And it was about how Trump, just a few months into his tenure, had already stripped a lot of information off of government websites and changed what was available that you could access on government websites. I wonder whether data collection is going to look the same around data sources that I've used over the course of my career for different projects. I did a big project, and I know a lot of reporters have, out of data that came from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights series. They
Mm.
produce really robust data on chronic absenteeism by race and other justice related topics in schools, corporal punishment, things like that, and at all the way down to the school district level. And boy, is that a valuable resource. But every time I think about a government data source now, I wonder, will that be there next time that it would normally be updated? And I don't know. And you think about the census and how important the census data is, and how much fighting there has been over whether changes to the census can be made that might encourage or discourage participation of particular groups, or may or may not allow people to report their own gender identity in certain government data collection series. It's a lot to think about. And working with any government data source right now, it's very important to read the fine print and check to see whether the way this information was collected or how they're defining certain variables is the same as it was prior years before drawing conclusions using that data. Like, you really do have to be skeptical right now.
Have you started gathering alternative sources? What are the ways that you're preparing for the possibility of these sources being gone or altered or not as complete as they used to be?
I think, like you talked about, looking at more independent sources and maybe advocacy groups that are collecting data is great as well. So, in the justice space, the Bureau Institute of Justice does a great job with their own data collection and analysis, and there are immigration groups that work very hard to provide maps of where all the detention centers are when that's not reported by federal agencies, and so on. And so, looking at non-government sources who have an expertise in the topic area that you're interested in is a great tool. And I know there's also resource hubs that are kept by institutions like Harvard that you could potentially go to that might have archived data, but might also have their own data. Or maybe it's working with researchers and using data that they've made available, or looking at survey data from places like Gallup that operate independently but can offer some context as well. So trying other sources.
Do you have other sources that you turn to often that you'd like to give a shout out to?
What I really like about Gallup is they have a social series of polls every month. They focus on a different social topic, and one month is crime. And so that's really good for me because that means every year they ask a series of questions about crime and perceptions of crime. But one of those months every year they ask about the economy. If you were an economics reporter, that would be a great resource. And these places that offer polling, if you talk to them and you're a journalist, oftentimes you can get underlying data as well, rather than just the report that was available online. And you
Yeah.
can use that in your storytelling. There's a series of different polls by not only Gallup, but I think Pew and Ipsos and other places to look at how people were perceiving the National Guard deployments in places in big cities last year. And you could just see how unpopular it was by looking at those data sources. And that's data that's totally usable, even if you struggle to get other kinds of data on the same topic, like how many people maybe are arrested in some of these incidents.
But do you know the Jail Data Initiative too?
It sounds familiar, but I can't picture it off the top of my head.
Yeah, they're NYU's public safety project, but they've been doing daily jail, local jail, and mapping it, doing trends and all that stuff. And yeah, they can't get it for every jurisdiction. Obviously, it's hard, but they're adding more and more. So I think, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do with the project that I'm working on is compile all of these alternative sources, all of the people who are working to fill in federal data gaps into one place where researchers and journalists can turn to. So I'm always on the hunt for more, and I'm always trying to connect people to different sources.
One more I will mention is the Council on Criminal Justice. If you're interested
Mhm.
in crime statistics, they have reports and their own data collection to look at recent trends in different types of crime. And so if you're looking for a non-government source that is probably going to have less of an incentive to say one thing or another thing about the crime data, but just provide a report on the crime data itself, I think that's a good place to look.
Do you, oh, so going back to the project you were doing on drug testing after births, were you able to talk to sources for that to contextualize the data?
Absolutely. And I really have to hand it to my colleague, Shoshana, who has been really doing an outstanding job in that space. And I was focused more on the data for that project, but she was deep in trying to find impacted people. And it's very hard for something that is extremely personal and doesn't happen all that often. If you think about it, you have to find somebody who not only had a baby, but also was drug tested or otherwise accused of using drugs, then was referred to law enforcement and is willing to talk to you about it. And not only willing to talk to you, but provide you with records and allow you to ask very intrusive and personal questions about that story. It's hard to do. And she spends a lot of time building trust with people. And transparency is not only in data journalism, but in that kind of reporting. Absolutely. Tell people exactly what it is that you're doing. Tell people that you can't guarantee that their participation is going to change anything, but that this is what we do and why we do it and why we talk about these topics. And she was able to find people who had been impacted. She spoke with a woman named Diana who she taking CBD gummies to help with very bad nausea, and she was accused of using THC products, and she was arrested and she was put in a jail cell, and she lost her ability to breastfeed because she had been separated from her newborn. That, to me, like that's the story. Do the data splash the number 70,000 on it, but it doesn't matter if Ayana's not there and we're not talking about what this actually means.
I feel making those connections, building trust, and the transparency, like you've been emphasizing, that is really the solution for a lot of problems that are facing journalists right now, with not only the problems of the job, but also coming from the outside, being attacked, being questioned, the press is the enemy kind of thing. If we have these connections with the public, then it's a little bit harder of a narrative to sell. Is there anything that I missed? Anything else you would like to add?
The only thing I'll say is that we offer consultations for journalists who are interested in learning more about stories that we've done, data sets we've made available. We offer webinars and we speak with not only journalists, but with researchers and groups who want to learn more about our reporting. And so that is available and anybody can feel free to reach out.